There are men who make the whole world smile, and Roy Clark was one of them. For nearly 3 decades, his face beamed out of television screens across America every single week. That wide grin, those sparkling eyes, that guitar or banjo always cradled in his hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. He was a fixture, a comfort, a weekly reminder that life still held joy. Families gathered around their television sets on Friday nights and laughed along with him. Children grew up thinking that was just who Roy Clark was, the happiest man in America. But happiness, as those who knew him best would one day learn, is not always what it appears to be. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes it is the strongest thing a man can reach for when the truth inside him is too heavy to carry out in the open. When Roy Clark passed away on November 15, 2018, at the age of 85, inside his beloved home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the world mourned a legend. His family mourned a husband, a father, a grandfather. And then, in the quiet that follows every great loss, they began the process of going through what he had left behind. What they found would change everything they thought they knew about the man behind the music. Roy Linwood Clark was born on April 15, 1933, in Meherrin, Virginia, the son of Hester Linwood Clark, a tobacco farmer and semi-professional musician, and Lillian Clark, who played piano. He was one of 7 children born into a household that had very little money but an abundance of music. His father played banjo, fiddle, and guitar. His mother filled the evenings with piano. From the time Roy could form memories, sound was the air he breathed. The family moved often in those early years, chasing work as the Great Depression tightened its grip on rural Virginia. They spent time in Staten Island, New York, before eventually settling in Washington, D.C., when Roy was 11, after his father found steady work at the Washington Navy Yard. It was in Washington that something extraordinary began to unfold. Roy picked up the guitar at 14, and almost immediately, the music world took notice. By 15, he had already won the National Banjo Championship, not once, but twice, in back-to-back years. By 17, he had made his first appearance on the Grand Ole Opry stage. There was something in the way he played that went beyond technique. Other musicians noticed it too. It was as if the instrument were simply an extension of the boy, as if the music were coming from somewhere deeper than his fingers. The early years of his career were anything but easy. He worked clubs and dance halls. He toured with Grandpa Jones. He played backup for performers far more famous than he was, absorbing everything, watching everything, becoming better with every road mile behind him. In 1957, he married Barbara Joyce Rupert, a woman who understood from the very beginning that loving Roy Clark meant accepting the road as part of the bargain. During their first year of marriage, Barbara drove him to performances across hundreds of road days. That was not a small sacrifice. That was a declaration of faith. Their marriage would last 61 years, and it would outlast almost everything else in Roy's life. By the 1960s, Roy Clark had become one of the most in-demand touring musicians in Nashville. His television appearances began to multiply. He appeared on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts. He joined Wanda Jackson's band and played the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas. He was, by any measure, a man on the rise. And yet, those who were closest to him began to notice something that no audience ever saw. Behind the warmth and the ease was a restlessness, a private weight he carried that no amount of applause seemed to lift. He had developed a reputation for being perpetually cheerful, for filling every room with laughter. But there were nights, Barbara would later recall, when he came home from a performance and sat in silence for a long time, staring at nothing. Roy Clark struggled with alcoholism and depression during various stretches of his career. These were not secrets he volunteered. They were burdens he managed the only way he knew how, through music, through performance, through the relentless forward motion of a career that never stopped demanding more of him. He said yes to everything, because slowing down meant confronting what lived in the silence. Then came hee-haw, and with it, something Roy Clark had perhaps never fully experienced before: genuine, massive, enduring fame. The show launched in 1969, and Roy Clark co-hosted it alongside Buck Owens on CBS. From the very beginning, it was a phenomenon. Set against a backdrop of rolling cornfields and country humor, hee-haw was warm, familiar, and completely its own thing. Roy Clark was at the center of it all, playing guitar solos that made professional musicians set down their coffee and lean forward, cracking jokes in the next breath, laughing that big full laugh that seemed to come from somewhere inexhaustible inside him. The show ran in various forms until 1997. Over the course of that run, it made Roy Clark one of the most recognizable faces in America. The awards piled up. He was named Entertainer of the Year 3 times, by both the Academy of Country Music and the Country Music Association. He won the CMA's coveted top honor in 1973. He was the first country music artist to headline a concert at the Kennedy Center. In 1976, the CMA designated him International Friendship Ambassador after he led a historic concert tour of the Soviet Union, bringing American country music behind the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War. In 1987, he was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry as a member. In 2009, he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The list of honors was, by any measure, extraordinary. But behind every curtain call, behind every award, behind every grinning television appearance, was the same man who sat in silence at the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept. The same man who poured his pain into private music that no one was ever supposed to hear. The same man who, sometime in those decades of fame and recognition, quietly sealed a door in his private music room in Tulsa and told his family never to open it. Roy Clark moved to Tulsa permanently in 1974, the year he and Barbara purchased a home there. He embraced the city with genuine affection. He raised money for the Children's Medical Center. He became co-owner of the Tulsa Drillers minor league baseball team. In 1978, an elementary school was named after him. Tulsa was not just a place he lived. It was a community he poured himself into, a place that gave the performer a different kind of identity, the identity of neighbor, of generous local figure, of a man invested in something beyond the stage. But the music room in that Tulsa house held something the community never saw. Tucked behind stacked amplifiers and instrument cases, against the back wall of the room where Roy spent his most private hours, was a small wooden door. He had told Barbara it was storage. He had told his children not to bother with it. For decades, out of love and respect, they had honored that wish without question. After all, Roy Clark was a private man in the ways that mattered most, whatever the stage suggested otherwise. When he passed away in November 2018, the family began doing what every family must eventually do. They moved through the rooms of a shared life, deciding what to keep, what to remember, how to hold a man who was no longer there. Roy Clark's home was filled with decades of an extraordinary career. Gold records lined the walls. Vintage instruments hung in their proper places. Photographs captured moments with presidents and legends, with fans and friends from half a century of music. But the door in the music room remained. It was Barbara who finally turned her attention to it, days after the funeral, when the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet in that particular way it does after a life departs. She had always assumed it was simply a storage closet, perhaps full of fragile instruments or old equipment Roy had never gotten around to sorting. The assumption had been easy to maintain while he was alive, because he was simply there, filling the space, making the question feel unnecessary. Now the silence around that door was different. It asked to be answered. The key, when they finally found it, was tucked inside the lining of an old guitar case, a small, ordinary thing that had been hidden in plain sight for who knows how many years. When it turned in the lock, the sound was quiet and reluctant, the way old metal moves when it has been still for a very long time. Inside was not chaos. It was not the clutter of a man who simply never cleaned out a closet. Everything had been arranged with deliberate care. Cardboard boxes were stacked neatly, each labeled in Roy's careful handwriting. Manila envelopes, tied with string, lay in orderly rows. Magnetic tape reels were lined up on a wooden shelf, their labels written in the same slanted hand. A worn leather case sat in the corner, its brass latches dull from age. This was not the space of a man who had simply run out of places to put things. This was a room that had been intentionally prepared, an archive of something Roy Clark had decided, at some point, that he could not destroy but could not bring himself to share. The family spent hours that first day going through the contents with the kind of careful reverence that people bring to the belongings of those they have loved and lost. There were personal letters. There were pages of handwritten notes, thoughts that read like a private journal never intended for any eyes but his own. And at the back of the shelf, behind the rows of tape reels, was a sealed envelope addressed in Roy's handwriting with a single instruction, "For my family. Open when I am gone." Inside the envelope was a cassette tape. Written on its label in Roy's hand were two simple words, "Play alone." That night, the family gathered in the music room. His banjos hung silently on the walls. His guitars rested in their stands. Barbara found one of Roy's old tape decks on the shelf, still plugged in, dust settled thick across its surface. She inserted the tape with hands that were not quite steady, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then came the hiss of old magnetic tape, the warm static of time passing, and then, his voice. It was slower than they remembered. Quieter. It did not carry the energy of the stage or the warmth of the television host. It was the voice of a man speaking in the dark, to no one but himself and the machine, and eventually, to the people he loved most. He spoke of the years that built him, the Virginia childhood, the Washington streets, the clubs where he taught himself to be better every night. He spoke of what fame had cost him in ways that no award could offset. He described the experience of building an entire public life around laughter when the private life was not always light. He talked about the gap between the man on the television and the man who came home. He talked about the silence after the applause, and what waited in it. He spoke of the struggles with alcohol that had shadowed certain years of his life, of the times he had reached for the bottle when the weight inside him became too much, and of the long, hard work of pulling himself back. He talked about Barbara, about what her steadiness had meant to him, about 61 years of a marriage that held even when he was not easy to hold. He talked about his children, and the fear of letting them down, and the parallel fear of being truly known. The tape ran for nearly half an hour. It was not a polished piece. It was not composed or edited. It was simply a man saying the things he had never managed to say while he was standing in the same room as the people he was saying them to. Near the end of the tape, his voice grew softer still, and he said something that sat with the family long after the recording had clicked off. He said, "Everything I built out there, the jokes, the smiles, the music on the big stages, that was real. I want you to know it was real. But this was real too. And maybe this is the part one should have let you see sooner." Over the following days, the family continued working through the closet's contents. The tape reels on the shelf, when played, revealed something no one expected: original recordings of Roy Clark performing music he had never released, never shared, never played for any audience. These were not polished studio sessions. They were private compositions, recorded on a home machine, sung and played in the solitary hours when the house was quiet and the world outside had no claim on him. The songs were unlike anything in his catalog. There was no showmanship in them, no performance, no reaching for the crowd. They were spare, honest, and weighted with a sorrow that contrasted with everything the public had known of him. One song, played on an acoustic guitar with no accompaniment, described the long exhaustion of keeping a face on for the world. Another circled around loss, not any specific loss that the family could identify, but the accumulated loss of a man who had spent decades carrying grief quietly. Others were more hopeful, as if Roy had been working through something in these recordings, using the music as both confession and comfort. That had always been what music meant to him. From the time his father taught him to play guitar at 14, music had been the place where the inside and the outside met. The stage had transformed that private relationship into something shared with millions. But in that closet, on those reels, was the version of it that had never been shared, the music Roy Clark made for himself alone, when no one was watching and no performance was required. The family sat with those recordings for a long time. They listened to every one of them. And when they were finished, the house felt different, not diminished, but expanded, as if a room within Roy Clark that they had never known existed had finally opened its door. To the country music world, Roy Clark was a giant. To hee-haw audiences, he was a weekly friend. To the people of Tulsa, he was a neighbor of 44 years who gave generously and asked for little in return. The Country Music Hall of Fame honored him. The Grand Ole Opry claimed him as a member. The Soviet Union invited him to bring American music across the most significant cultural divide of the 20th century. He was, by every external measure, a man who had achieved everything. But what the closet revealed was the measure that does not appear in any citation or award. It was the measure of a human life, not the highlights, not the honors, not the carefully curated public image, but the full complicated truth of a person who laughed so the world could laugh with him, who performed joy because joy was needed, and who carried his own private weight with a discipline that most people will never be asked to summon. Roy Clark's family made the decision not to seal that door again. They left it open, not as an act of exposure, but as an act of understanding. They had spent 61 years living beside a man who was larger than most, who had given more to the world than most, and who had kept one small room of himself entirely his own. Now that room was part of the story too. Not a shadow on the legend, but the depth beneath it. The happiest man in America, it turned out, had known sorrow the way all people who have truly lived come to know it, deeply, privately, and without apology. He had faced it in the only room where he felt safe enough to do so. And he had left the key where someone he trusted would eventually find it. That, perhaps, is the most Roy Clark thing of all. Not the performance, not the awards, not the decades of bringing laughter into living rooms across America. But the quiet faith that the people who loved him would, when the time came, be strong enough to hear the whole truth. And that they would love him still. They did. They do. They always will.